Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the DPRK carries out live-fire artillery drills as it celebrates the founding anniversary of its military, while South Korea and the U.S. closely keep watching. And Chinese students studying abroad come home in droves to seek jobs or to start their own businesses. Is it by choice or circumstance? And we begin today's show in the DPRK, where the country held an artillery drill instead of a nuclear test to celebrate its Army's 85th anniversary. The DPRK reaffirmed its resolve to respond to any actions, and the U.S. warned it will take military action as concerns mount. The DPRK may test a sixth nuclear bomb. The hardline rhetoric is ratcheting up the tension. Let's take a look.
There have been enough confrontational acts and rhetoric recently. What we need are rational voices and peaceful solutions.
Another call for calm. That message, delivered directly by Chinese President Xi Jinping in a phone call with US President Donald Trump early Monday, saw Xi urging all parties to exercise restraint. The two leaders pledged to work closely on the issue. For weeks, tensions have been mounting over Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions, as the DPRK has a tradition of showcasing its military capability on significant dates. The US has refused to take military action off the table as it moves a nuclear-powered submarine and the USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier group towards the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK responded with a newspaper commentary threatening to sink the USS Carl Vinson. Adding to the tension, the DPRK detained a third US citizen over the weekend as he tried to leave the country. The man had worked as a teacher at a university in the country. It's not clear why he's being held. In an unusual move, Trump hosted ambassadors from the United Nations Security Council at the White House on Monday to discuss tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
And it's a problem we have to finally solve. People have put blindfolds on for decades, and now it's time to solve the problem.
But the question is how. Senior diplomats from the US, Japan and South Korea agreed on Tuesday to pile greater pressure on the DPRK, urging it to abandon its nuclear and missile programs. On Wednesday, the White House wants Congress on board with any future actions the US might take against the DPRK. Yet the peninsula will be a touch-and-go situation that makes many wonder what can be done.
So how do we ease up on the saber rattling of the Korean Peninsula? Just loop in our panel. In Beijing studio, we have Mr. Teng Jianxun, Director of American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Meanwhile, joining us in Medford in the United States, we have Mr. Song Young Lee, who is a Kinku Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School at Tufts University. We are also likely to be joined by an American panelist with us later in our program, but I want to start with the two. So, Mr. Teng, so many actions and rhetorics coming from all sides over the past few days. Do we see any change of directions in terms of policy and strategy?
Actually, we have two battlefields. One is on site, another is in the United States. That means diplomatic battlefield. Donald Trump just held a luncheon, for the 15 members of UN Security Council. This is actually a very important arrangement. This is not only for lunch. I'm sure everyone knows that. This is for policy explaining to the members of the UN Security Council. And another is the deployment of SSBN submarine, and also the aircraft carrier battle group is now heading to the surrounding waters of Korean Peninsula.
So what does that mean?
Two battlefields by the United States.
Diplomatic and also military possible.
Military. So I think the DPRK also gave a strong response, including the live fire artillery drill today. And today is actually the 5th anniversary of the Army Day for DPRK. So I think the two sides both show their tough position toward each other.
Apparently, at least. Professor Lee, what about your sense? Where are all sides heading for?
You know, the world has so grown inured to accustomed to North Korean bluster that we tend to laugh at North Korea and be dismissive of North Korean rhetorical threats. And when North Korea actually steps back, takes a step back, not having conducted a nuclear test or a ballistic missile test on its major holiday today, Army Foundation Day, we tend to think that North Korea is fearful, or that the Chinese have put enough pressure on North Korea, or that the U.S. bellicose rhetoric has pushed North Korea to retreat. However, I think this is a tactical step back, not even a tactical retreat. The next provocation will come at a time of North Korea's own choosing, and that will be the real test of how much resolve there is in Washington and Beijing to address this growing North Korea threat.
Very interesting point. In a statement, in fact, on Friday earlier last week, the DPRK's foreign minister accused Mr. Trump, the U.S. president, of driving the region into what he called extremely dangerous phase with the deployment of an aircraft carrier. Pyongyang said it will, quote, react to a total war with an all-out war, a nuclear war with nuclear strikes of its own style. So these are kinds of repeated rhetorics of détente, in a way, coming from the DPRK. But having said that, though, Mr. Tang, what do you make of Professor Lee's statement that, in fact, all of the surrounding countries, China, South Korea, Japan, the United States as well, Russia, who used to be in the six-party talks, actually are all working around a time schedule as the DPRK pleases?
Yeah, I think this is a very specific moment for all the parties concerned. The 6 countries in this region actually show big concern to the development or the escalation of the situation or the tension in the peninsula. We should have 2 explanations. First, I think the DPRK leaders actually still have a dream that in the past 60 years, almost all the game played by the United States and by DPRK, DPRK has won almost all the clashes, including the taking custody of the spy vessels from the United States. And today, I think the DPRK leaders still, had such a dream to continue the story. This is one side. Another side, I think, the United States have changed a new leader. Donald Trump is very different from the previous leaders, presidents. For example, actually the United States is now facing the real direct threat from DPRK, as he mentioned during the lunch. All the threat from the DPRK is real. If the United States faces a real threat or direct threat, U.S. leader will give real consideration not only to manipulate the DPRK nuclear issue, but it will have some choices on the table to deal with the threat from DPRK.
Professor Lee, it seems that our Chinese panelist is trying to suggest, as time goes on and circumstances change dramatically as a result of the nuclear issue development, actually strategies have changed, not only in Washington, but also in other capitals as situation got worsened or the development of nuclear program in DPRK continued. Professor Lee.
Well, we laughed at North Korea when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in October 2006 because the yield was so small. We're not laughing any longer. The latest test back in September last year was as big as the US bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and the next nuclear test could be perhaps 20, 30 times bigger than that. So we're taking North Korea seriously, and this belated sense of urgency that we see in Washington, D.C. is something new. Now, South Korea is a factor in this as well. As you know, we have a presidential election in South Korea in less than 2 weeks, and the front runner is an advocate of returning to South Korea's old policy of generous engagement of North Korea, dialogue, more economic cooperation, and so on. So for North Korea to be a factor in the remaining time leading up to the election on May 9th, one would think North Korea should refrain from provoking the South, but it doesn't work that way. North Korea needs to remind the nervous South Korean public that South Korea needs to return to dialogue and engagement, or else. So I think the time is ripe for North Korea to do something, an external provocation in the form of a serious missile test or a nuclear test in the coming days. And that's when we'll see how China responds, how the US responds, how Japan responds.
This is another interesting point, which we need to put out in this discussion fairly. That is, have all sides put themselves into a corner. In other words, as rhetorics ratchet up, as military options really on the table in the waters of the Korean Peninsula, for example, US aircraft carrier. And when China also pledged as much as it could to do to prevent anything from happening, have we all put ourselves, except the DPRK, into a corner?
Yeah, this is really a reality for all the parties concerned in this region. Actually, different countries have played very different roles in the past 15 years. For example, during the first round of the six-party talk in 2003, China was only a mediator. China established the forum for the United States and the DPRK to have a face-to-face discussion or dialogue, negotiation. And because there is a principle in the hand of the United States that the United States could not give a face-to-face or direct contact with the counterparts from DPRK. And at that time, China was really a mediator. But today, as we have witnessed in recent months, between the two leaders, I mean between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump, the two leaders actually are really serious in dealing with the real and direct threat from DPRK for the sake of all the countries in this region.
All right. So while we have temporary peace for now, on the 85th anniversary of the establishment of the North Korean Army, are we going to have that in a few days from now? Professor Lee, you are certainly retrospective in pointing out the history and also all sides' interactions with DPRK. But where do you think the strategies are going from different parties? Let's just say, starting from the United States.
I think American policymakers realize that North Korea is no longer a child throwing a temper tantrum just for the sake of attention. It never was, but that's the belated realization. I think policymakers realize that North Korea, the North Korean leader, is not crazy or suicidal, so quite unlikely to nuke Washington, D.C., even though the bluster suggests otherwise. And what that means is the de facto peace, unstable and imperfect as it has been over the past 60 years, will probably remain. The status quo will continue. At the same time, North Korea does seek to change that game with its demonstration that it has the capability, backed up by intent, to marry a nuclear warhead with an intercontinental ballistic missile. So when that day comes, that will be a game changer. No longer will kicking the can down the road, procrastination and half measures will work.
At this point, we don't know when that game changer will come, but already at this point, 6 nuclear tests will come for all the parties involved, certainly on the nuclear issue. We are also joined right now from the United States, Washington, D.C., Sharon Squassoni, the Director and Senior Fellow of the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Squassoni, welcome to our program. I know you've been working for decades on the non-proliferation issue. DPRK nuclear issue, certainly one of those on your agenda. When is that game changer going to come? Some say a few years, some say probably the 6th nuclear bomb already would make all parties change their very direction of strategies.
No, thank you. I think for the United States, clearly the game changer comes when our territory can be targeted with North Korean nuclear missiles. That day isn't here yet, right? So there's some uncertainty about the range of the Musudan missiles. The longer range missiles have not been effectively tested. We're not quite sure. There's a range of uncertainty there. That's a few years into the future, but you know, with every test, whether it's a ballistic missile test or nuclear weapon test, the North Koreans learn more. So that's why I think there's some urgency added to this problem right now. I would say, however, that the Trump administration has injected more urgency than is probably good for the situation, and so that's why we're all watching this very closely.
Mrs. Guasoni, you know better than all of us that right now in Washington, D.C., a meeting is likely to be conducted between senior members of the Congress and also the Defense Secretary on the latest development in DPRK. Some say it could just be action put out by the Trump administration to alert Pyongyang that they could really be serious about this. Others say there are really some plans already on the table. As we all know, Mrs. Guasoni, earlier there was so-called a strategic plan on DPRK being drawn up and provided to the President Trump. Do you think militarily U.S. is ready?
Oh, it's so hard in Washington these days to tell fact from fiction.
That's right.
Quite honestly.
I guess anywhere in the world these days.
Right, no, exactly. But so Trump has, yes, there will be a meeting tomorrow in Washington, D.C. Mr. Trump is supposed to gather the entire Senate together. That is a very unusual thing. Most people are looking at that with a little bit of a skeptical eye. You know, the end of this week marks Mr. Trump's 100 days in office. That is often a benchmark by which all presidents are judged. You know, how well did they do? He doesn't have a lot of good things to tally up, right? His health care reform died. So I look at that particular meeting very much as a little bit of theater, a little bit of reality TV.
Okay.
That said, obviously, the U.S. military is quite professional. It has probably a range of options and plans on the table. My guess is that there's not going to be much new there in terms of what the military options are, but I would also say that we've heard a few promising things from administration officials about, no, we're going to seek, we're not going to seek military options, we're going to seek a negotiated solution. Obviously, when you listen to Vice President Pence, he then walks that back a little bit. Look, Washington is in disarray at the moment, and I don't think that any plan that we hear about this week, if we do hear about a plan, is either, very serious or very well thought out.
Very interesting.
So, what'll be interesting tomorrow is
it will be interesting to watch
what their reaction.
Yes, exactly what they're going to say and what they're going to say to the press after those briefings. But there are so many things going on with the different countries. Mrs. Guasoni, you talk about the 100-day. Interestingly, for Mr. Trump, the U.S. president, but in South Korea, Professor Lee talked about there's an election in 2 weeks. In North Korea, of course, it has always been in a way of being provocative. That put Mr. Tang, your country, China, in a very strange position. President Xi called Mr. Trump once again this week and urged all parties to constrain and also work toward the same goal rather than work hard on very different directions. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Yeah, I'm sure there is a window of opportunity already, occurred in the Korean Peninsula, and most important thing for the United States, for China to cooperate, is that, as we discussed now, the two countries have already realized the real and the direct threat from the missile and from the nuclear capability in DPRK. And originally, actually, the United States, in the past 20 years, manipulated the nuclear issue in DPRK, sometimes just for the sake of the United States, and for the deployment of U.S. troops, and also for the consolidation of the alliance with the ROK and with Japan. But now, as Madam Scotson just mentioned, the United States is now really facing the threat from DPRK, the missile capability and the nuclear bomb. So I think this is a foundation for China and the United States to cooperate.
But Mrs. Squassony, you talk about the, two options by the president. There's a aircraft carriers in the waters of the Korean Peninsula. There's also a lot of rhetoric of also cooperating with the Chinese side, yet the U.S. side has never said we're going to offer you with the carracks. All the other two options could be sticks. What about that agreement about the ceasefire? What about what's going to happen after the Korean War, which the North Korea has claimed has always been one of the biggest challenges for them to seek security? Ms. Squassony, is that day going to come for the U.S. seriously consider about that, the security guarantee so-called?
Right, so there's a wide range, or
I heard a long
serious
sigh
opposition
from you, Mrs. Squassony. I understand what is behind that long sigh, but what Mr. Tong just said is that there is a window opportunity. Everybody, don't miss it. Window opportunity here, Mrs. Squassony.
Right. So the question is, will we recognize that? There's a long history about whether the U.S. should conclude a peace treaty with North Korea. Some people say at this point, some experts say, yeah, we should do it. I think a lot depends on what happens with the South Korean elections, and if that new government has a more, I don't want to call it a softer policy, but a more engaging policy with North Korea, and doesn't have a problem with the United States concluding that peace treaty. But the question is, ultimately, if we did that, what then? Would North Korea actually denuclearize? So there's always the question of, yes, there is a very concrete list of things that we could offer North Korea in exchange for certain actions on their part, and that's ultimately the calculation. How serious is Kim Jong-un about ratcheting back these security threats that not only threaten the United States but also potentially China and South Korea and Japan?
We don't know, right? I mean, we don't know. That is exactly the problem, that we don't have any strategic trust, not to mention long-term trust among any of the parties we're talking about. So, Professor Lee, I want to go to you finally. Are there plans, do you think, parties could take? Who is likely and who should do that first step, the very critical step?
If the new government in South Korea to take place in May returns to South Korea's old policy of generous engagement of North Korea, giving North Korea virtually unconditional, no questions asked aid, the atmospherics will change. The argument for engagement and direct negotiations will become stronger. The argument for more financial pressure and sanctions will perhaps be marginalized. So that's what North Korea is probably hoping for. With respect to a peace treaty, it sounds very nice, and North Korea has been suing for a peace treaty since the early 1970s. And the main reason that the U.S. has not obliged is because a peace treaty between the U.S. and North Korea will inevitably call into question the very raison d'etre of the U.S. troops in South Korea. It will lead to the downgrading of the US-ROK alliance, perhaps US-Japan alliance. People will ask, why are US troops in a peace treaty between North Korea and the United States? So once we go there, then I think the balance of power in the peninsula shifts slightly in North Korea's favor. North Korea will be able to extort South Korea with greater freedom. And, historically, peace treaties and non-aggression pacts between adversarial powers have been shown to be a historical canard. There was a famous non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1938. 1 year later, there was war.
Well, I guess it takes a lot of wisdom, and it also takes audacious leaders to, in a way, take some steps to see where things are going. At least we are not heading for a dead end. Now, who will do that? We'll have to see. But for now, thank you so much, the three of you, for shedding some light on the very confusing situation on the DPRK nuclear issue. Teng Jianqun, Song Yong Lee, Sharon Squassony. Thank you very much for all of you. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Chinese graduates in overseas universities are returning to China in greater number than before, but will the Chinese job market be able to handle both returning students and local graduates? Right after this break. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN every Monday to Friday. 10 years ago, most Chinese youths who sought degrees in developed countries chose to stay in the host country after graduation because the job market there could absorb them. But now things have changed completely. China is getting ever better, and 2016 saw the most students abroad return to China, and analysts even predict a turning point in the coming 5 years. Before we go to our discussion about what is really behind this phenomenal change, take a look at this.
Next station, homeland. For years, China has been the biggest source of students studying abroad worldwide, to many of whom returning home after graduation was the best option.
I share the same culture with people there, and I find I can truly release my potential working in China. But also, China is a huge market, a lot of opportunities there.
For others, the reason is discouraging. In many companies, including in Silicon Valley, Asians hit a glass ceiling.
Despite being a large percentage of the workforce are represented disproportionately in the leadership roles of those companies. Now, on the prospect of returning to China, those of us who have received higher education in the West hold an advantage. We are considered to be free thinkers. We are considered to be able to bring advanced expertise to the Chinese workforce, and therefore we're going to be more treasured.
Whatever the reasons are, China is facing the highest returning wave of students abroad. Since the opening up in 1978, over 4 million Chinese went to study abroad. Up to the end of 2016, over 2 million have come back. In 2007, only 30.5% of students abroad returned. 5 years later, that number rose to over 70%. In 2016, over 80% chose to be back. Some believe that tougher visa policies are also behind the trend. The majority of Chinese students go to English-speaking countries, the top three being the US, the UK, and Australia, all of which now have stricter visa policies.
It's America first. You better believe it.
But for overseas returnees, things might not even be easy in China. Many have lowered their expectations of income amid fierce competition. This year, an estimated 660,000 returnees are going to join a record high 7.95 million domestic college graduates in the job market. A recent survey found that nearly 64% of overseas returnee respondents said their expected annual income ranged from 70,000 to 120,000 yuan. But that doesn't mean that the number of Chinese students abroad will decrease. Even though overseas experience does not translate into good jobs at home, many Chinese parents are still willing to send their children overseas for higher education.
That is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Joining me to talk about that, Ms. Wang Yan in Beijing. She is from the National Institute of Education Science. Welcome. Also joining us here in Beijing, we have a never become a sea turtle or returning American to the United States, David Mercer, Academic Director of Chinese Studies at the Capital Normal University, even though he is bringing American students to study here in China. Welcome to both of you.
Thank
what
you.
a pleasure. Wow. these students are just coming back in such a huge amount. Is the job market going to be ready for them?
Well, actually, the job market is pretty tight, not only for the returnees, but also for domestics.
Absolutely.
So it could be challenging for them to find an ideal job, especially their expectations are very high.
Because their parents paid a lot of money in order to get the overseas education, haven't they?
Yeah, even for the cost recovery purpose, they might want to find a job with a decent salary, but that could be very difficult given the number of the persons seeking jobs in the labor market and also those returnees plus the domestic graduates.
That's right. Yan has been talking about the job market, but what about the qualities of these returnees? When we say returnees, meaning Chinese students studying abroad and not coming back to have a job. Some say they're of two very different extreme groups. One is those are really talented, high academic scores, really precede everybody in terms of academic achievements. They go to some of the best universities in the United States, or in other countries. That's one group. The other group, well, probably they wouldn't even get to a very decent university here in China, so their parents pay a huge amount to get them educations overseas. And there are those educational institutions elsewhere that would accommodate them. So, David, what do you make of these two groups and their qualifications and their opportunities back at home?
Well, the job market is tightening up, that's true, but China is transitioning its economy to try to move away from a manufacturing base to a more innovation, high-tech and service industry base. So those students who have specialized in those fields should do all right when they come back. And a lot of those people used to be, when I first came to China, if someone went overseas, Chinese, they would never. That was
centuries ago.
It was the Qing dynasty.
No, 20 years ago.
But if they could make it overseas, they would never come back. I think now a lot of them have the skills, and they also have good English, which is still a marketable skill here. And they think, why not go back? My parents are there, and they'll go back to maybe the second or third tier cities. So I can see why they would go back. Not all of them are going to be winners, but some of them will do quite well here, I think.
What about that phenomenon? I mean, yeah, that returnees are not going to be something anymore. It's just one of those. And what would that mean for them? Families. They expect much when they go there to study, and their families, their parents saved their whole life in order to support them. Now they're just one of them.
Well, one obvious reason is the gap between the higher education quality between those developed countries and China is closing up. And the qualities and the skills that these students try to seek in overseas universities now are accessible and available in the domestic universities. And on top of that, the domestic graduates also have their comparative advantage. For example, familiar with the local culture and the social connections. For example, if they got opportunity of internship in one institution, they might be more likely to stay on to get a job there. So that's a kind of advantage that overseas graduates won't have.
That's true. And for those overseas graduates, they seem to have a very different feeling about China also while they are studying abroad. I was approached by several students before our interview and tried to do some pre-interview with them. Some of them were suggesting, before in China, they would follow every American soap opera. But now, when they're in the United States, even studying some of the best institutions, they tend to follow even the entertainment news here from China. It seems that they don't want to be disconnected with China. They think their final destination is still back at home. So what about that? Is that going to make them very competitive in their studies abroad? Or can their attention span be able to focus on so many different factors while they're studying abroad?
I think that a lot of students, in the old days, would have liked to come back, actually, because they were outside of their own culture. If they could make a good living in China, they would.
Or they have a good academic environment.
Or have a good academic environment. They could come back. In terms of we're talking about some of the people who are the highest level technical expertise coming back. To tell the truth, if I were a big brain like that that had been schooled in the United States, I would look at China in a different way now. I would say, in areas such as genomics, in artificial intelligence, China is now leading the way.
One of those.
And I might think, maybe it's a good idea to actually go back to China. If I had a choice between Google and Baidu, Baidu also looks pretty good. So I think that would, if you're looking for a high-powered career, Beijing or China, some of the big first-tier cities is not so bad. If you're not at such a high level, the job market is still going to be better at the second or third-tier cities like Qingdao and Tianjin, and different Dalian, whatever, which have very nice standards of living.
While being away for several years, whether it's for university, even graduate school, and probably some even had the high school education overseas, there is a disconnect. No matter how much you focus on the information coming from China's mainland every day on the internet, but there's still a disconnect of what is going on here and what they heard and what they understand. So when they come back, is there also going to be a cultural shock? Can that cultural shock last long? And will that be, in a way, challenge those returnees in their competitions against or together with the so-called locally educated?
Well, there is definitely cultural shock, but the degree varies from the person to person, also varies from groups to groups. In particular, if the students went abroad at a younger age, when they come back, they might have larger or more cultural shock. And also, if they have the more stereotype of the local Chinese culture, when they went abroad, China is changing so quickly. Every day there is a big change. So if they assume that everything stays the same, then we come back, definitely there will be a shock. They will be shocked.
They will be shocked. And some even say, are they going to be competitive against, those international students who are coming to China after their graduation, try to seek a job over here? David, you have brought many of those to China.
That's true, but the ratio is not very good. We have something like 300,000 Chinese students studying abroad. I don't think we even have 30,000 Americans studying abroad here, or even maybe all the foreigners. So there's still a very big disparity there. The students that might come here are looking for what we would call a China career, and it's a very different kind of thing. They don't tend to be here for a long time. They want to use that as a CV builder, some way to build a better career when they go back. The Haigui that we're talking about, the returning Chinese students, they're coming back because, as you say, they feel disconnected. They want to come back to this culture, and they feel like, now I can go back because China is wealthy, powerful, and I can make money here, and I can live a nice life, high lifestyle here.
Is there a difference? I mean, you were educated in the United States in university in Washington, the state of Washington, by the way. Is there a different mentality, let's just say, compared to current generation to your generation? There seems to be more of personal goals and egos, and in your generation, some were suggesting there seems to be that big dream of making China stronger. I don't know whether there's a generational divide like that. Is there? Yan?
Well, actually,
a big smile on our face. What does that mean?
It's hard to say. This is a very good question. I noticed the difference, this sort of generation gap between myself and my younger colleagues, and I asked them, and also just from their performance and the daily behavior, I was thinking, are we really the same in terms of this kind of aspiration, especially patriotic aspiration? But one thing we're sure is every day everybody witnessed the huge change that taking place, and also the rapid growth that's occurring in China, and we are proud of what has been achieved in China, and we're happy with growing together with this country. I think this feeling probably has been shared with all the people,
I see,
regardless of which generation they're in.
Final point from you, David, just very briefly. While China, of course, having many of the returnees back home, the United States, for example, some of the other countries are having very different visa policies these days. They want to say America first, or their own jobs for people for their own jobs for their own people. What do you make of this difference?
With the visa situation?
Not necessarily visa situation, but rather attractiveness of a country, of a job market.
I think the United States is going down in popularity for many, many reasons. The economy is cooling down. It still has the top flight universities, but China, the attractiveness of China is definitely on the rise, and that's going to affect not only the Chinese that come back, but other countries that might think of having a career here. So yeah, I think China is on the way up.
It's better that all the countries are luring for talent so that there will be a great opportunity for everybody from whichever country. But for now, I want to thank the two of you, David Moser, Wang Ye. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, you can try to look for us, World Insight with Tianwei, CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow our program's Twitter and Facebook over here. And from me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team with Tianwei, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights from across China and around the world. Good night.